Hi everyone, I'm Marnie Florin.
And hi, I'm Kevin Perry.
And this is the Trans 101 section of the Building Awareness, Empathy, and Accountability. We're going to start with the gender unicorn. And this is a very cute model of gender. And any time that you take something as complicated and as individual and complex as gender and try to fit it into cute diagrams and boxes, you're going to miss a lot of details and a lot of nuances. And so for that reason, a lot of the trans community doesn't love this diagram. But I still use it because I think it's really important when starting off this conversation about what it means to be transgender. So if we start at the top, you see gender identity. And you can see the rainbow and that thought bubble. So gender identity is something you feel in your head. It's not visible to anyone around you. Gender expression, on the other hand, is visible to everyone around you. Your clothing, your mannerisms, how you style your hair if you have any, if you wear makeup, if you wear jewelry, all of those things that typically have some sort of societal idea of whether it's feminine or masculine. And then we have sex assigned at birth. And you can think of this as the determination that a doctor makes when looking at a baby. We typically think of the options as being just male or female, but there are actually a group of folks who are born without genitals that are distinctly male or female, and those folks are considered intersex. What's important to know here is that typically intersex folks are not allowed to live life as intersex. They are forced into one of the categories of male or female, usually at an early age with procedures and without consent from them. We're not going to focus much more on the intersex community. I just think it's important to make sure that you know who they are. And then you have secondary sex characteristics. And so these are things that develop after puberty. So female secondary sex characteristics are things like breasts or hips. Male secondary sex characteristics are things like having a deeper voice, more body hair, that sort of thing. We typically think of this as being very static and unchanging, but you'll see as we go on that that's really not the case. So now that we've gone over those basics with the gender unicorn, if we talk about what the word transgender means, it means anyone whose gender identity differs from the sex assigned to them at birth. There's a lot of different words that someone who identifies as transgender might use to describe themselves, and you'll want to use the word that that person uses. Cisgender refers to folks like Kevin, whose gender identity matches the sex assigned to them at birth. And I'm guessing the majority of you would identify as cisgender. Cis is Latin for on the same side of. Non-binary gets a little more confusing. So folks who are non-binary identify as transgender in that their gender identity does not match the sex assigned to them at birth. But it goes a step further. So folks who identify as non-binary identify outside of being a man or a woman. So their gender identity is something else. And when we say binary, male, female, man, woman, that's typically considered the binary. So if your identity is anything other than a man or a woman, then you probably identify as non-binary. There's a lot of different words that go under that umbrella. Genderqueer means different things depending on who you are, but it's pretty synonymous with the word non-binary. Bigender might mean that you identify as a man and a woman. Agender, genderless, gender neutral could mean that you don't identify with gender at all. You don't see yourself as having any gender. And gender fluid might mean that your gender changes over time. Some days you feel more like a man, some days you feel more like a woman. Pronouns are very important to the trans community. Folks who are trans and identify as a binary, either as a man or a woman, are going to use the pronouns that men and women typically use. For women, she, her, hers. For men, he, him, his. For non-binary folks, it gets a little more complicated than that. So most non-binary people are going to use gender-neutral pronouns. There are so many gender-neutral pronouns out there. And in the resource site, you'll see links to great kind of charts that show you all the different grammar conjugations that you can find. And some people might have a preference for which one. Most people will just be happy if you're using anything gender-neutral. The most common ones are ze or they. And so, Kevin, do you want to show us what it looks like? So if someone says, hey, where's Marnie?
They went to the bathroom.
Or where's Marnie using Z?
Z went to the bathroom.
Perfect. And so what would you do if you messed up a pronoun? What would that correction look like?
I do mess them up all the time, but it's my mistake, and so I just correct myself quickly and then move on. You don't want to make a big deal of it, but you also want to make sure that nobody else overhears you and thinks, oh, that's okay, Marnie uses she. So make sure you correct yourself, but then don't make a big deal of it.
So if I say, where's Marnie?
They went to the bathroom.
Perfect. It's as easy as that. Always better to correct if you remember, and the quicker the better. So as I mentioned, a lot of trans people don't identify with that gender unicorn. And there's one Googler in particular, Fish, who's from our Cambridge, Massachusetts office, who disliked it so much that they actually made another alternative representation of gender. And it's important to show because I don't want you to get locked into the idea that one model is the only way to go for this. So if we use this and we start at the bottom, if you think about these boxes, if you match between one box and the next, you can experience a confirmation, maybe even a euphoria. If where you are in one box doesn't match the next, you can often experience dysphoria. And there are medical definitions for it, but basically it's a really bad feeling. I would say that all trans people experience dysphoria. Not necessarily the same kind, but often it's that dysphoria that leads you to start realizing that you might not identify as cisgender. But cis or non-trans people can also experience dysphoria. So we'll give you a few examples as we go through. So if you start at the bottom, you see your body, right? The way your body looks. If that doesn't match your brain body map or the body that you expect to see when you look in the mirror, you can experience body dysphoria. So for someone who's not trans, this can look like a person who's lost a limb recently and looks in the mirror and expects to see that limb and doesn't. That weird sensation would be dysphoria. Or maybe someone's pregnant and recently started showing, and they're not used to seeing those body differences when they look in the mirror. That's also an example of body dysphoria. It's very rare that your brain body map does not match your gender, and so there's no word for that. But it's often that your gender might not match how others see you. And you can think of gender as similar to gender identity in the gender unicorn, and you can think of how others see you as similar to your gender expression. And so if your gender does not match how others see you, you can experience social dysphoria or misgendering. For me, I identify as non-binary. When people look at me and they see what they assume is a pretty butch lesbian, that's social dysphoria, right? Because I don't identify as a butch lesbian. That's not who I am. There's also going to be times when maybe you're a woman with a deeper voice and you get called sir on the phone. Again, an example of social dysphoria or misgendering. And then finally, if how others view you doesn't match your social role, you can experience role dysphoria. And this is probably common for stay-at-home dads or female engineers, especially female engineers of color. There's probably a lot of times when people don't see your role as it really is. We know this is a lot to take in. And if this is the first time that you've thought about what the word transgender means or gender identity and all of this, it can be kind of overwhelming. We want to make it more tangible for you. We're going to walk through that gender unicorn using me as an example and show you what it looks like for a real person. And this is also a time for me to tell you a bit about my journey as well. A decade ago, I identified as a girl. I used female pronouns. My gender expression was pretty feminine. I wore dresses. I had long hair. I didn't think that I was trans. Some people know from a very early age I didn't. But what I started to notice was that social dysphoria. So when people would tell a story about me using female pronouns, it would take me a minute to realize that they were actually talking about me. And the longer this went on, the worse it felt every time I noticed. And because I had a very tough time coming out as gay in college, I knew pretty quickly that cisgender or non-trans people don't have that social dysphoria with pronouns. So I knew something was going on. I happened to be working at the LA Gay and Lesbian Center at that time. And my supervisor was a trans guy. And so in my head, I thought, well, if I don't identify as a girl, I guess I identify as a guy. I tried a new name, I used male pronouns for a while, and it felt better, but it didn't feel perfect. And it was hard to know at that time if male pronouns weren't for me, or if I had just gotten so used to using female pronouns, for the past 25 years, that anything different wouldn't have felt right. But after a while of kind of going back and forth between female and male pronouns, I realized that I identified as something other than that. I was non-binary. And so now that's the identity that I claim. I would say I identify slightly as a man, ever so slightly, but sort of just think of myself as being gender neutral. In terms of gender expression, very masculine presenting. I was assigned female at birth. But for secondary sex characteristics, 2 years ago, I would have said completely female. Since then, though, I've had top surgery, which means that I've had my breast removed. So that's a female secondary sex characteristic that I no longer have. And I went through that procedure because I did experience a lot of body dysphoria. And if I were to start taking testosterone, for example, then my voice would get deeper. The fat in my body would distribute in different ways. I'd grow more body hair, so I would start to have male secondary sex characteristics. Not all trans people are going to take hormones or going to have surgeries, what we would call physically or medically transitioning. There's a lot of reasons why. Some people might not experience body dysphoria, whereas I experienced a lot of it. Some people might not be able to afford it. We're very lucky here at Google that that type of surgery was covered, but for other people, it's incredibly expensive. And the important thing to know is that having medically or physically transitioned does not make anyone more or less of a woman or a man or more or less trans. That's based on gender identity.